So they would step in, absolutely. Now let's consider another scenario, and we don't need to go through all the details of it, but I think it's helpful. So let's imagine that a woman from another country, let's imagine a woman from from Saudi Arabia, or we could say from another time. Let's say a woman from England 200 years ago. Very conservative society. Let's say that she visits the United States, goes down to Texas, and we take her to a fashion show for children. I've seen some of these shows on TV, something with the tiara, I don't know what the shows are, you probably do. Right, and these are the beauty shows with 7- and 8-year-old girls. What do they see? Well, we might see families trying to raise their kids according to our American values of beauty and stamina and talent, and so these girls are modeling themselves on models, and so there's a whole industry and a whole cultural understanding of beauty shows and beauty and modeling and all this kind of stuff. So we see that and we understand it in the framework of our culture. And yet this woman comes and she's absolutely horrified. Because what she sees is a child or children being sexualized. A 7- and 8-year-old girl with makeup, wearing bathing suits, prancing around like an adult woman, to her would look like the exploitation, the perversion, and certainly the corruption of a child, specifically in a sexual manner. She would see emotional violence being done to this child. She would see psychological violence being done to this child. She would see exploitation, because all of this is done, of course, for money. People don't go through the hours and hours and hours to prepare all of this for nothing. It's for money. Usually the kids are not the ones getting the money. And in general terms, I think this woman would see perhaps an even deeper ethical problem here, which is that God created, according to this traditional society, God created men and women and created children, and they all have their part and they all have their place. And part of the place of the family and of the parents is to protect and honor sexual modesty. Right? A young woman, the last thing that she should ever be doing is flaunting her body for the public, treating her body as a public object for display. She should be keeping herself closed off in a lot of ways. The way she dresses and the way she walks and the way she talks should not be an open display, should not be something that invites people to ogle over her and ask about her beauty and all of that. She should be waiting and preparing herself for a husband for whom sexuality is a private matter, only between them. And to violate this, and to treat sexuality, and to treat children, and to treat anyone before they're married as a kind of sexualized object that we should look at, would be a gross violation from this perspective. Now, it's hard for me to see a lot of difference in these scenarios, in the sense that in one case, the American is going to another culture and seeing children being exploited, being violated in certain ways, in different ways, but there's a lot of violence and trauma occurring from the perspective of the outsider, right? And these are so grievous to both of the outsiders that their instinct is to either flee in horror or to rescue the children, or both, right? Rescue then flee in horror. But neither of these visitors is going to be willing simply to say, no big deal. Doesn't bother me. One of the reasons for giving these two scenarios is to say that relativism has a difficulty within it, and the book talks about some of this. It's hard to see how anything could ever be criticized from the relativist point of view. It's almost as if the nihilist could criticize things more, because the nihilist says, I don't even say criticism is right or wrong. I don't care about tolerance. I don't care about cultural values. That's just another set of ethics that I don't believe in. I don't think that's any more real than anything else. The relativist is trying to hold on to some sort of ethics. They're trying to say, don't judge other cultures. But on what basis? It's hard to see ultimately on what basis the relativist could criticize. But if the relativist wants to criticize, one of the clear implications of that, one of the clear results is that they have to be willing to be criticized. So if one culture is, well, the relativist will not criticize cultures. I guess the bigger point is that if we can't ever criticize cultures, when could cultures ever change or improve? And on the relativist perspective, that's kind of a meaningless question, because no culture's values are better than any other, so no culture ever improves its values. They just change. And when they change, they're new and different, not better, not worse, because there are no common standards of better or worse for the relativist. There's nothing between cultures, above cultures, that can serve as a standard for us to say, if we got rid of slavery, that would be morally better. It's impossible to say on the relativist view. A culture with slavery, culture without slavery are equal, as long as they're real cultures. That, I think, is the most damning criticism of relativism that the book brings out. It's the last one that I had you read, which is, what's a culture? I don't know what a culture is. We can arbitrarily say it's people with the same language or the same religion or the same geography, but ultimately that breaks down very, very quickly. If you look at the United States, many cultures in the same place. Do we have a common culture or not? I don't know how you could ever answer that. All right, let's dig into relativism and its perspective a little bit more. According to the relativist way of thinking, what's happening in these two scenarios? Well, you begin with the obvious observation that these scenarios are presenting a situation where different cultures have different views of morality. But, okay, let's dig down. What does that actually mean, to say different cultures have different views of morality? It seems to mean, for the relativist, that every human being lives inside a culture. I think I mentioned this in one of the sections. It's an interesting metaphor. Inside a culture, as though it were a place you occupy. That's why I emphasized before, if I travel down to another country, according to the relativist, I'm still inside my own culture. So the view here seems to be something like this. You're born as a human being with a kind of blank slate, nothing there, and the culture imprints or kind of shapes your way of thinking so deeply and so profoundly that that's just who you are. There's no you except for that. So culture is everything. Now, some people say, we learn based on our experiences. And the relativist is kind of agreeing with that, but the relativist is saying something even more specific, that what you learn are your cultural experiences, or the way your culture teaches you to experience the world and to think about the world and to care about the world ethically. So you live inside a culture because the culture lives inside of you. Therefore, if you're inside a culture, if you can't get out of it because it is the way you think, you are by definition not in any other culture. You are shut off. It's as though each of our heads has like a horizon, and we can only see within that, we can only see in that horizon, shaped by culture. And when we meet another human being, we're experiencing the world from within our picture, and they have their cultural picture, and they can never penetrate one another. They can never communicate. So I just have my culture, you have yours. So ultimately the relativist says, I can't know what you're thinking. I can't understand your values. Maybe I can learn your language, but I will never get inside the culture that you're inside of. Why? Because I'm inside my own. I don't have resources for getting out of that. It makes me who I am, and it makes you who you are, so we're doomed to this limit, this absolute limit in understanding. Therefore, we can draw the conclusion for the relativist that if we can't share perspectives, if we can't share ways of understanding the world, we can't share ethical perspectives. We can't share ethical, moral values either. Therefore, every culture defines right and wrong in its own ways, and there's nothing we can say about it. The book does, I think, a nice, fairly clear job of criticizing relativism in some respects. So I'm not going to repeat that. What I want to do is mention a few other perspectives that we'll be looking at this semester, and give you just a quick overview of some other ways of responding to relativism. So the first, and the book just mentions this, we might call traditional religious authority. And that is to say, you know, human beings are not above culture, but something else is. That's God. God's above culture. He's the origin of everything, and that's the end of the story. So if God said it, said, thou shalt not whatever, then you do it, because God is the ultimate authority. So that's a traditional way many societies have thought of ethics. That's the way many people still think of ethics. But in the modern world, where we have been exposed to hundreds and hundreds of other cultures and other religions, there are some obvious questions with this theory. And we'll get back to these questions later in the semester too. But two obvious questions would be, which God are you talking about? Because we can't take it for granted that when we say the word God, everyone now is going to agree what his name is and where he comes from and which one we're talking about. So obviously different gods in different religious traditions could offer many different ethical perspectives. So if you read the world scriptures, you find differences. So which God is important? And then even if we can somehow agree on which God these rules come from, which rules? We have something like, what is it, 700? I should know the number. 700 commands of God in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Most people don't follow all of those anymore. So if you base your ethics on the authority of God, which God, and then which rules, it becomes a pretty messy, difficult question to answer. But that's one response. You just say, you know, cultures are just people's opinions, but we have access to someone who doesn't need opinions. He has the truth. He knows right and wrong, and that's God, so let's just listen to him. And if God says your culture's doing something wrong, your culture's wrong. Now, another similar kind of perspective, and this is going to be related to hard universalism most of the time, can be called Enlightenment rationalism. These are two big words. Enlightenment just refers to a period in Western history beginning in the 17th century, going for a couple hundred years, where scientific discoveries, Isaac Newton, these kinds of people, scientific discoveries, travel around the world, technological advances, all these kinds of things, philosophical theories were really exploding, and people were beginning to invent and create radically new ways of living and ways of thinking, democracy being one of those. But for our purposes with ethics, Enlightenment rationalism says that what a human being is not defined by their body, by their parents, by their biology, by their experiences, by their language, or by their culture. All of those things are present. All of those things are part of who we are. But ultimately, what defines a human being is our ability to think. So Enlightenment rationalism is going to constantly contrast human beings with animals, for example. It's going to say we share bodies, animals have bodies, animals have tongues and feet, and they're different, but they have all those things, and animals have a history, animals have blah blah blah, but what animals don't have, and that humans do have, is reason, the ability to think abstractly. So if this is part of who we are, Enlightenment rationalism says it's the most important part. We have a body, we have desires, we have feelings. We've talked about this a little bit in class. All of that's true. But all of that doesn't make us who we are. What makes us who we are is our mind and our ability specifically to think about higher, more abstract truths. So for ethics, that would mean, in Enlightenment rationalism, as we'll see, was the effort, and continues to this day, the effort to clear away a lot of the things that are different about human beings, clear away a lot of the things that are just accidental, cultural. So you could say it's kind of an accident. I was born in the United States. I could have been born somewhere else, but I'm still a human being. So what's essential to me as a human being isn't that I was born in Iowa, it's that I'm a human being. So as a human being with a mind, I should be able to ask questions about human beings. I don't have to ask myself about Germans. I don't have to ask myself about people who live today in this culture or that culture this time. I can ask questions about humans in general. I can analyze ethics and think about right and wrong in terms of human beings in general. And culture isn't the... come on, yes, sir. my roommate just stepped in. Culture isn't the final word. The mind, they said, with lots of hard work, lots of training, lots of effort, can seek to ask questions about humanity in general, about right and wrong in general, that stand above the particular accidents of history, the particular conditions that I'm a part of. So we will see that Enlightenment rationalism developed some very interesting and specific ideas about how we can know right and wrong above our cultures. I'm going to finish recording this, take about 5 minutes, and just feel free.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that because I just got out of class.
You want to meet my students?
Huh?
Want to meet my students? We're on camera.
Oh, you are? Okay. Hello.
This is Evgeny.
Your office mate.
Yes. Bedradinov?
Bedradinov, yes.
Bedradinov, yes. So I'm explaining ethics to them.
Oh, great, great.
And we're just discussing Enlightenment rationalism.
Okay. That's a very important topic.
Yes.
I could testify to the relevance and importance to
Oh, wait, a testimonial right there.
Excellent.
All right, so we'll finish in a couple minutes. Another modern response to ethical questions can be called scientific hedonism. Another big words, and I mentioned this in a couple sections. But scientific hedonism says that rationalism is wrong to treat human beings as these intellectual beings. Ultimately, a scientific perspective of humanity will say we are all animals. That is our essential nature, not our thinking powers, but our animal nature. But we are clever animals. And as animals, ultimately what we seek and what drives us is pleasure and the avoidance of pain. What we might in general call happiness. So if we take a scientific perspective on the question of ethics, ethics has to be oriented towards happiness, because that's our essential nature as animals. So ethics should be about spreading, producing as much happiness as possible, and as little misery as possible. So there are no big high ideals here, no big feats of the mind, intellectual feats of rising above your culture and finding the universal laws of morality. That's all the rationalist perspective. Instead, you have a commitment ethically to what is naturally best for all. And sometimes they'll say all creatures, not just human beings, and that is promoting their happiness. So notice that both of these views, however different they are forms of hard universalism, in the sense that they're both saying there are universal truths about ethics that all people should recognize. The first is saying they'll recognize them because they can think about them abstractly. The second one is saying they'll recognize them because if you go to any culture, say the guys who are in the circle, with the kids in boxing, this view says if you explain to them and remind them that all human beings prefer happiness, all human beings prefer pleasure to pain, etc., that they will say, you know what, you're right, and what we're doing probably isn't very good because it's causing too much suffering and not enough happiness, and they should be willing to stop. I don't know. Would that work? The last view I want to mention here we'll call traditionalism. And this is the view that it seems to agree with relativism at first. What it says is that ethics come out of our traditions. Ethics is, for each of us, something that we learn. So very similar to cultural relativism. But this is the difference. Traditionalism says there's no reason to think that a culture gets implanted in our brains like the Matrix or something, and then we're just living in this culture forever. What this culture says is if you're in another culture, for example, the one that we talked about, and you encounter a situation that's abhorrent to you, it's true, and the relativist would agree, that you probably don't have a good reason for stepping in if you want to say everyone in the world should be able to see that this is wrong because it violates some universal principle. The traditionalist says, I can't find that, I can't see that. This is what the traditionalist is going to say. If you spend a couple years in that culture, what you can do is begin to learn the norms, begin to learn the standards, begin to learn the traditions. And what you will find is that every tradition has multiple values, multiple teachings, multiple goods that they say are important. So the boxing scenario is something that people are doing, and they're defending it, saying it's entertaining, it's good for the boys, and it's good for the economy. But there will be other elements of that tradition which say you shouldn't exploit children, or you shouldn't gamble, or whatever it is. That every tradition, this is the point, every tradition is rich it's in itself, it's diverse and pluralistic. So if you learn the tradition well enough, then you can talk to people and say, hey, you are breaking the rules of your own tradition. You are violating some of the basic teachings that you yourself say you should honor. These are not my values from my culture that I'm bringing to you. I'm reminding you, I'm showing you that you're violating your own principles. This to me seems pretty reasonable. I don't think it's impossible to go to other cultures and begin to understand how people live. You'll never become perfectly like them, but you can also become somewhat like them and understand them to some extent. And in doing so, you have access then to some of their values and norms, and if they're not living up to them, that's a perfectly valid form of critique, to critique their lives according to their own standards. And of course, we have to be ready for the woman from Saudi Arabia or the woman from England 200 years ago to come to our culture and to say, you have traditions, you have values that you all say you honor, and you all say you respect. This beauty show or this part of your culture is an embarrassment to your own traditions, to your own cultures, to your own values, and you need to stop it. So traditionalism has a bit of faith that traditions and cultures are not narrow, rigid, and tight, but has some faith, perhaps by experience, by going around the world. This view says, look, most cultures and most traditions are much more fluid and flexible and open-ended than the relativist would say, and therefore learning the culture and applying its own standards to its own practices is a perfectly reasonable and acceptable way to critique another culture. But of course we have to be willing to do that to ourselves as well. Alright, I've somehow rambled on, so I will stop now. But your assignment is to come to class with an answer to the question, what would you do if you were in this situation of the boys boxing and the gamblers and all of that? If you want to talk about the other situation as well, someone coming in, maybe how would you respond? So if you had a kid in the beauty show, fashion show, and someone from another country came in and criticized you in these terms, what would your response be to them? Let's use these scenarios to really flesh out some of your ideas about ethics and about cultural relativism for next week. I'll see you then.